Hey there. If you're thinking about buying a home, refinancing, or just exploring your options, Lane will walk you through every step of the way. Lane takes the stress out of the mortgage process so you can focus on what matters most. Whether it's using your home equity to get money for home improvements, finding the right loan for your first home, or if you just want to ask some mortgage questions, Lane's heart is to serve. Call or text him at 618-671-1830 and get the mortgage advice you need. That's 618-671-1830, NMLS number 2413537. Edge Home Finance NMLS number 891464. Equal housing lender. Now on to our show.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Particular Baptist Podcast. I am your host, Daniel Vinson. You can find us and other podcasts at reformpodcast.com. Also, check out our blog at theparticularbaptist.net. And if you would like to join our little army of patrons, you can do so by heading over to patreon.com/the particular Baptist. That is a great way to support our ministry and help keep us going. To join us over there. Thank you to all those who are already patrons. If you'd like to support us in that way, you can do so at patreon.com/the particular Baptist. All right. So diving into our topic today. Sorry, I had a squirrel moment over there because I'm sitting right by the window that looks out in the front yard. Free will, a topic that comes up frequently in our circles and just in the theology world in general. If you've been following Leighton Flowers for any particular amount of time, you know how much emphasis he puts on that and his little band of blasphemers over there. We'll get into that in a minute. But there is this is something that always comes up in Calvinism. It continues to be debated on a frequent basis, but I don't know if it has been really talked about front and center in our circles, or maybe it has. Could be wrong, but I don't hear it much. Been in the Reform world for a very long time, much if at all. But what are the implications of a libertarian free will? And I think that is where it is not talked about as much in our circles or even in the debate itself. And I think there is quite a bit of misunderstanding about the significance of free will as it relates to the implications of it. And when it's discussed from our side, I don't think it's done in a way that really captures that seriousness of it. Okay. And I'm talking about what's known as libertarian free will or independent free will. And I'm not talking about free will in general, because there is a free will properly understood biblically and in the Reformed tradition. But when you're talking about libertarian free will, like you would find in a more like a provisionist movement, or in the at least in the classical Arminian sense, where you see guys like John Owen dealing with this issue and addressing these concerns that are coming up as it relates to the issue, you do see implications as it relates to the doctrine of God and how that plays into understanding who God is and how he works in the world. So you do see that quite a bit discussed in the Reformed tradition, and you know, what are the implications of this as it relates to God and man, and how does that play into man's ability versus God's power, things like that. And when you're talking about it in relation to God, this is where this notion of blasphemy comes into play, because there is this real sense where the Reformed tradition saw this as a serious implication when we're talking about libertarian free will. So when we're talking about libertarian free will, and I think there's probably many different definitions depending on who you talk to, but where I'm coming from, what I'm talking about in terms of libertarian free will, is when we take it in an absolute sense that teaches that man's will is free from any cause from God to act, right? At least in an immediate sense. You're talking about God is not in any way causing man to be, as the Reformed tradition would say, but that his will is completely independent of God's providence. That is what we're talking about here. God isn't involved in any of the actions of men as understood in confessional Reformed theology. Man can act of his own power as a human apart from God's providential sustaining power as it relates to his providence. And this is what you find in the classical Arminian tradition. I think we don't put enough emphasis on how bad Arminianism really is. And I do want to make a distinction to some extent. Modern Arminianism tends to be more Calvinistic because there is, I think, a general acknowledgement among Arminians today that would acknowledge some sort of sovereignty of God. God is truly involved in people's lives, and he does work providentially. I do think there is an understanding of that, certainly not to the extent that the Reformed tradition would, but I think there is a general acknowledgement of God's power in the universe, and that man isn't so free as to be completely separate from God's providential power. And of course, you're going to find different flavors of that in the Arminian camp, but I think that modern day Arminianism isn't necessarily going to fall into that sense. But in the classical Arminian sense, it's going to be very very explicit in its denial of God's providential work in man, and that man truly is free of God's providence and independent in his actions and determining things apart from any work of God in sustaining us and causing us to be. And so you do see a stronger pushback against this in the Reform movement. But I think maybe because of the watered down nature of modern day Arminianism, you do find, I think, and just ignorance too, I think, because this is modern day quote unquote Calvinists aren't reading the historical guys typically. They just aren't. They're reading the John MacArthurs, they're reading the Pipers, they're reading, the B.B. Warfields, the guys who are pretty much post or at the 19th century and onward. You're not finding a lot of interaction from people using like a 16th century Baptist or Reformed who dealt with this extensively. John Owen, for instance, in the 17th century, writing an entire work on Arminianism, a discourse on Arminianism, I believe it's called. I was reading some of it today, where he goes through point by point, at the very least, like key sections of Arminianism. How do they talk about man and original sin in terms of his corruption? How about the providence of God? How about this? How about that? Salvation, and where they get it wrong and where they might be overlap. But it's really a critique of Arminianism, and you see Owen talking about Arminianism in very strong terms, because Arminianism in that time was certainly more of a explicit pushback against orthodoxy and Reformed theology. Maybe not as much as it is today, but today you do find there are people who do believe. I mean, you see Free Will Baptists, right, who do emphasize the freedom of man in salvation and maybe even in general, who do see God's providence not applying to the will, at least in some sense. So I think that may kind of be where you do see kind of this watered down response. I think a lot of it is ignorance. A lot of modern day Calvinists, I say that with air quotes, they just don't have the historical depth of argumentation knowledge to be able to deal with these things in a meaningful way, because these things have been dealt with historically extensively by the Reformed. Extensively. I mean, Turretin, the Baptists, the Owen, Beza, they're all talking about these things long before the MacArthurs come along. And there might be some good things from MacArthur, but it's not going to be the same depth and strength and thoroughness that you're going to find from like an Owen or a Cox or a Beza. where they're writing and dealing with argumentation in a very detailed way and going through and exegeting texts and fleshing these things out more. So yeah, I think there is a depth of discrepancy in terms of the people arguing and the knowledge that they have. So there's that, and then I think just the fact that Arminianism has largely been watered down from its kind of original state, and you find it's not maybe as potent as it used to be. So I think that those two things kind of lead to maybe the way the response to it is just not really as strong as it should be. Even today, I think we give Arminians too much credit, to be honest with you. I'm not necessarily going to say that they're not Christians. I do think that there are good Christian people in modern day Arminian settings. I don't think there were any Christians whatsoever in the classical Arminian sense that they were dealing with, like in the 17th century, the Reformed were dealing with, just because of how brazen and consistent they were in their theology. But in a modern day sense, I think that there are a lot of Arminians who are just inconsistent. They're wrong, and it's serious, but it's not as brazen and consistent to the point where I would be comfortable saying that they're just not Christians. Yeah, and I think it depends. There might be some that are more classically Arminian that you might be able to say, but I think in our day and age, modern Arminianism has to be taken on a case by case basis. So I think you do find this, these factors coming into play here. But when we're talking about free will, again, free will is not. I think sometimes modern day Calvinists make this mistake and they just say, well, there's no free will whatsoever. That's garbage. We don't believe that. The 1689 is very clear. There's a whole chapter dedicated to free will. And like if you read Owen's work on Arminianism, he basically uses the same language as the 1689. I mean, the 1689 is partly based off the Savoy Declaration, which Owen helped write. So you're seeing language that's very similar. In both of those, the concepts are the same, right? But Nehemiah Cox, in his work against Collier, from the Baptist perspective, you see him talking about free will because Collier was coming into all kinds of issues with this. And he says, quote, his liberty consists in rational spontaneity. This is talking about man as it relates to a biblical understanding of free will. Sorry, had a little bit of drip here. His liberty consists in a rational spontaneity. He acts freely, that is, under no coaction, which alone is opposed to liberty and the true notion thereof, but doth what the least impractical judgment of his own understanding dictates to him, so that one that acts necessarily may yet act most freely. God cannot but love and delight in himself and order all things to his glory, yet he is an agent in every respect most absolutely free. The good angels, now confirmed by grace in their station, and glorified saints, cannot but love God, choose and delight in perfect obedience to his holy will. Yet in all this they are free agents, because they are thus determined by no external force, but by the dictate of their own understanding. On the contrary, the devils and fallen man are by their own wickedness determined to sin, and that only, yet are they free in the choice thereof. End quote. That's from page 64 of Vindicae Veritatis, the work against Thomas Collier that Cox put together. So we believe in free will. The freedom of the will comes in that our will is not forced into anything. It acts according to our nature. So the examples that Cox gives here, he even uses the example of God. God cannot but love and delight in himself. God by necessity acts a certain way because it's who he is. Yet God is most free because he is not bound by anything, right? He is an agent in every respect, most absolutely free, as by his nature. So he acts according to his nature and does so freely. He's not coerced into doing this or that. He acts based on his nature. Just like Christians, when they are a new creature, right? They cannot but love God, right? In their station in glorified saints. And he talks about glorified saints here, to be clear. They cannot but love God. Saints that are glorified, they're in their final state, they cannot help but love God and obey him. And so what you find is that there is no coercion in the will, which is where the freedom of the will is really found. It's not that man is not dependent upon God as the first cause to act, which is basic biblical providence and Reformed theology. It is that man is not coerced into doing something. He acts freely according to his nature. Okay. So this is not a freedom from God to act of themselves, as God is only attributed with, and that'll come into play as a key element here in a moment. Man is not free from God to act of themselves, but to act relying upon God's sustaining power. Since we come from God, we are dependent upon him for being, living, and moving, as Acts 17 teaches. In him we live and move and have our being. And it's interesting, this is a key verse that Owen uses against the Arminian understanding of this absolute freedom of the will, that how in the world can someone who claims to be free be truly free if we live and move and have our being in God, as Scripture says? We live and move and have our being in God, so that means we are going to be dependent upon him in some way. There's going to be some causal effect that God is, there's going to be some causality there, that God is working in the actions of men and bringing them to act according to their natures. This is basic providence, and the scriptures are very clear that we cannot escape the providence of God and his power, or we would cease to exist, basically, if God is the one sustaining us. And this is what you find like in Thomas Aquinas, where he talks about God's sustaining power. If God ceased to sustain us, we would just poof, disappear, because everything that exists is sustained by the power of God. And you see this principle like in the First London Baptist Confession of Faith, in the appendix that Mr. Benjamin Cox added. He said, quote, although the power of the creature to act be from the Creator, and there is a providence of God always extended to every creature and to every action of the creature, yet we judge that the sinful corruption of the creature and the sinfulness of the creature's action is from the creature and not from God, and that it is a great sin to say that God is the author of sin. So God's providence extends to every creature and every action of the creature. If there was no power to act, we would not act. It's really that simple. And that's something that we have to, always be keeping in mind as we're talking about these things, that we cannot let go of that principle of participating in the divine essence, that we are derivatively acting because of God's power. We cannot act of ourselves. And I use that language deliberately, of ourselves. We can't act apart from God, of ourselves, because the scriptures teach that God is the only one who can act of himself, right? What does our confession teach? That God exists of himself, in and of himself, right? He doesn't need anything outside of himself to be or to act or to do things. He acts of his own nature. He is his own existence, right? And so once we start messing with those categories of providence and making our wills free, now we're getting into this notion that now we have a liberty that God has. And that is not something you typically find in these discussions when there are rebuttals against Arminianism today. People don't talk about it in relation to God necessarily. It's usually in relation just to the nature of the will itself. So the implications upon a biblical understanding of who God is are typically not considered. And honestly, I can't think of one modern day Arminian, not even Leighton Flowers, for crying out loud. And he's not an Arminian, or at least he claims to be a provisionist, but he doesn't believe that God providentially causes people to act and works in their wills and things like that. He doesn't believe that. He doesn't believe the power of God extends to every action of the creature. So, but he's also, as far as I'm aware, still a confessing Southern Baptist, which teaches God's simplicity. He's all powerful and infinite, right? Which these things don't go together. If you deny that man has a dependent will upon God, the only other option is that man's will is able to subsist of itself, exist of itself, and act of itself without, in terms of acting of its own power, apart from the first cause, right? It's no longer a secondary cause because it's no longer dependent upon the first cause. It is God. It is now its own first cause. It's now determining things of itself, which only God can do as the first cause of all things, as the supreme being, as the infinite, as the simple, as the immutable, right? And honestly, this is really how you deal with the concept of libertarian free will. Go back to God. How does this affect our understanding of God? If it makes God creature and less than the most perfect being and less than the infinite, the immutable, the simple God, then you are wrong. Your theology is just wrong, flat and simple, done, because now you have a different God. You've made God into a creature. You violated Romans 1, and now you really don't have the God of the Bible in that understanding, which means your understanding of free will and providence must be wrong, right? Again, this is what, like, John Owen, those guys went back to constantly. John Owen especially, it's God, it's God, it's God. The particular Baptist, it's God, it's God, it's God. It's about God. And the implication is, if you're going to mess with this, now you have compromised who God is, so your theology must be wrong. And with Owen, at least, it was just explicit. Like, here's the implications of this, and this is why it's wrong, right? You are making the creature God. And then Owen would just flat out say, it's blasphemous. He had no problem. He called it actually intolerable blasphemy. And I'm going to read a little bit here because I think this is important. Again, these are not categories that people use when arguing against, I mean, at least in the general argumentation that you find, people aren't calling it blasphemous. You know, they're not using strong language. They're not talking about it in relation to God necessarily. It's usually this very kind of canned argumentation that doesn't really get to the heart of the issue. This is the heart of the issue. This is why it's a mess, because it gives us a different God. And again, Arminians, I can't think of one that would deny that God is infinite, deny that God is immutable, deny that God is simple, at least just in a basic categorical sense. But, you know, they have no problem saying that, hey, yeah, man really is free of God's providence, right? Because the arguments typically go, well, that makes man irresponsible, or man is no longer responsible for his actions, blah, 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 that the whole silliness that comes from that. But they're confessing two contradictory things, right? Stephen Charnock, the Puritan, providence extends to all the actions and motions of the creature. Every second cause implies a dependence upon a first cause in its operation. If God did not extend his providence over the actions of creatures, he would not be everywhere and in all things and beings be the first cause. Again, the implication is now you are the first cause, right? You are the first cause. So looking at Owen, and again, there's some more stuff from Charnock here. God only is qualified for the universal government of the world. All creatures, as they were unable to create themselves, so are unable to manage themselves without the direction of a superior power, and much more unable to manage the vast body of the world. So basically, he's arguing that supreme power is only to God and not to man. Derry Dunn, thank you for the comment, said it is blasphemy. And I'm assuming you're referring to libertarian free will. And yes, I would 100% agree with you, as would John Owen. who I'm getting to here. Oh, it's the work is called A Display of Arminianism. And there's different places that he talks about, libertarian free will as a rights of providence. But chapter 4 of this work is a particular spot. He says, quote, "Nor yet leave them to a self-subsistence, he in the meantime only not destroying them, which would make him an idle spectator of most things in the world, not to work hitherto, as our Savior speaks, and grant to diverse things here below an absolute being, not derivative from him. The first whereof is blasphemous, the latter is impossible." So he's talking about, kind of like speaking hypothetically, like if this was to happen, this is what they're saying, right? If man truly has freedom from God's providence, this would give man self-subsistence, and it would not only destroy them, it would make God basically the idle spectator of most things in the world, and God would not be working hitherto, as Christ had said, and it basically would give us absolute being, because the only being that can truly have this power is an absolute being like God is, not derivative from him. So that would mean we're not secondary causes, so that the only other option is that you are a first cause. If your will is not dependent on anything, your will must be before everything, right? And what Owen says is that is blasphemous. He just comes out and say it. The first whereof is blasphemous, the latter is impossible, right? Basically, we can't be absolute being. It's impossible to do that. And it would be blasphemous to say that God is just an idle spectator of most things of the world, right? In other words, it would, to have this understanding of free will is a blasphemous notion. And then he would go on to say, "This opinion that God hath nothing but a general influence into the actions of men, not effectually moving their wills to this or that in particular, first granteth a goodness of entity or being unto diverse things, whereof God is not the author, as those special actions which men perform without his special concurrence, which is blasphemous. The apostle affirms that of him are all things." And he goes on to talk about other things, but basically, and he's talking about a different understanding of Arminianism that certainly has some semblance of providence, only in as much as there's this general influence into the actions of men, but not this effectual work in the actions of men, right? It's like, oh yeah, God is up there, just, he kind of guides stuff a little bit, but he's not really involved in moving the wills of men as he really is understood to be in the Reformed and in biblical context. So he's basically saying that this would mean that a goodness of entity or being into created things would be given to them that God is not the author of, right? "Granteth a goodness of entity or being unto diverse things whereof God is not the author, as those special actions which men perform without a special concurrence." So there would be things that would be coming from man that would be good, that would not be coming from God, which is blasphemous, because now you're making man God, right? And he backs it. The apostle affirms that of him are all things. And I think he's referring to Romans 11:36, which says that from him, to him, and through him are all things. Everything comes from God, even our actions. Of course, and we've talked about sin on the show before, and that sin is not something, properly speaking, so it can't come from God. But when we're talking about the actions, qua actions of man, those are things, and God moving us to act is a thing, something that exists, and it must come from him. The sin is only in the form of the action, which is in the creature alone, and doesn't truly exist as a thing, properly speaking. So the form of the action is bad, while the movement of it is good. That's a very, very basic understanding of concurrence there. But as classical Reformed theology, basically you can find that in Thomas Aquinas, which these guys are really following along. They're ultimately following the biblical language, but they're not coming up with this stuff in a vacuum either. This is long church Christian tradition. and understanding how God works in the world on from the scriptures. So, to answer the question, is free will blasphemy? Yeah, if you understand it in a sense that removes the providence of God from influencing the will, then yes. If you mean free will in that sense, absolutely, it's blasphemous. It treats God as a creature because now God really isn't in control of everything. Now there's something else that has his power, right? And really, you're bringing God down to a creature because God clearly can't do anything to your will to help you to move to whatever he wants you to a particular thing, right? You're able to act of yourself. So now God is dependent upon you and must react to you, right? If you do something, God has no control over it, and whatever happens in his actions outside of that are in reaction to you, right? So if he's responding to something that you did that he doesn't have control over, now you have this reactionary space where God is reacting to what man is doing and must basically come up with a plan to fix the problem because he can't control it in the first place. So now God is just a creature, right? He's dependent upon the autonomous person to act. So we have to be careful not to see this, an understanding of free will that you find in Arminianism as some sort of trivial matter. You have to be careful about that. It's not. It's not a trivial matter. The implications of it are deadly spiritually. Because if you take it to its conclusion, it means you have a completely different God. It means you believe in a different God, which means you don't believe in the gospel, because if you don't believe in the God of the gospel, you don't have the gospel and you're not saved. You believe in an idol and you're following something of your own making. You're violating Romans 1. You're suppressing nature at that point, and you're not worshiping the true God. And I think that's why you see Owen being so harsh with this theology, is because it was not something to be trifled with. It is blasphemous. It is disrespectful to God. It's trivial of God. It makes God creature. I don't know how much more blasphemous you can get than saying God is like us. It's not good. And I think when we're talking to people who believe in, even Arminians, while not accusing them of uh, being pagans necessarily, I think it's good to bring up that it is blasphemous what they are believing, that it's not something to be trifled with in the seriousness of it. I think you can say that, if you're dealing with someone who might be struggling with these things or who is an Arminian and may not have a full grasp on these things, or even the hardened Arminian who's just obstinate, it might, it's good to talk about it in those terms. This is serious business. It's a blasphemous notion to treat God like a creature, and show the inconsistency. If they confess that God is infinite, immutable, all powerful, yet you're holding to something that makes God none of those things, that's another great argument to use. Again, I just don't hear that in argumentation today when we're talking about modern day quote unquote Calvinists who are arguing against like the latent flowers of the world and things like that. It's just not something that's brought up. And I think that is a very strong argument. You have nowhere to go, right? You have nowhere to go. Talking about, how God works along with man's actions, those are good and fine. And I think getting into the weeds is helpful to some extent, because I think there are real questions as to the implications of God's providence in the world and how do we work through these difficult questions. Those are things to discuss. But when we're talking about the principle in general, we always have to bring it back to God, because that's the root of the issue. That's the main issue. And we need to always frame it in that light. At the very least, that's a foundation. Everything else is secondary, because even if you can't work those things out, if we understand that this makes God a creature, we don't have to work those things out. They just fall into place. They're necessary consequences of the fact that God is providentially involved in all things. It's just a necessary consequence of that. We don't have to work out how that necessarily is, even though we can explain it. There is explanation for Owen talks about these things. Turretin talks about these things, for instance. Even Beza talks about these things in depth. So there's answers to those questions, but those should not be where we jump to when we're dealing with libertarian free will. And that's just not what happened with the Reformed tradition. Certainly those weeds were talked about, but it was in relation to God. That was the key issue. God is the one who is all powerful, not us. Our wills are not all powerful. And so we have to act in talking about these things in our theology in relation to God and making sure our theology does not compromise who God is. Otherwise, this immediately makes our theology or shows our theology to be completely false. So hopefully that gives some helpful principles. I would encourage you to go read A Display of Arminianism. It's free online. You can go and look it up by Owen. It's a pretty lengthy work, but I think there's a lot of good stuff in there. And if you want a good explanation of a Reformed understanding of divine providence, that's a great way to go, because Owen goes into exegeting texts and talking through the principles of concurrence and God's providential power extending to man. He's using Acts 17:28, in him we live and move and have our being. So there's a lot of good discussions surrounding those texts that talk about God's providence. So, but anyways, I hope that this episode has been helpful and can give you some tips when you're talking about these things and some resources to use. We don't have to go in blind, guys. Use our history. We have tons of material. You don't have to read just John MacArthur on this stuff, or John Piper, or even R.C. Sproul. There's better people out there. Honestly, the old guys are much better at these things than the modern argumentations. We can read Owen, read Cox, read the Savoy, the First and Second London Baptist Confession of Faith, the Westminster, where these things are fleshed out. These things are fleshed out. There's so much there that could be used to help us and not give our opponents any ammo, and we can defend the faith, I think, much more effectively. Anyways, I hope everyone has a great rest of their weekend, and Lord willing, we will be back next week. Take care. Thank you for joining the Particular Baptist Podcast. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at The Particular B and subscribe to us on YouTube, where you can find more of our podcast content. Also check out our blog at theparticularbaptist.net. And if you'd like to support our ministry, become a patron today at patreon.com/theparticularbaptist.